I'm LaDonna Humphrey,
And I'm Amy Smith.
and this is the Lost Girls podcast, where we examine the cases that refuse to let families rest, the stories that deserve deeper scrutiny, and the women whose lives mattered long before they became headlines, statistics, or case files.
We look at missing person cases, suspicious deaths, unsolved murders, systemic failures, and the realities that families are often forced to confront when the official story does not fully answer the questions left behind.
And tonight's case is one that stayed with me long after I finished reading the records, because there are some cases that just disturb you. And then there are cases that force you to confront something much larger about society itself. Those cases where the official paperwork says one thing, but the details buried inside the reports keep pulling at you because they refuse to fit neatly into the explanation everyone has been asked to accept.
And I think it's important to establish right at the beginning that this episode is not about reckless accusations or sensationalism. We are not here to invent facts or pretend that we know more than the investigators. What we are doing is examining a case where the official conclusion does not erase the deeply troubling circumstances surrounding the death itself. There is a massive difference between saying, this woman died from drug intoxication, and saying, every question surrounding her death has been answered. Those are not the same thing.
That's exactly right. And tonight we're discussing the death of Isabelle Sam, a 44-year-old woman from Alaska whose death was officially ruled an accidental overdose, but whose family believes there are still serious unanswered questions surrounding her final hours and the circumstances in which she was found.
But before we begin, listeners should know that this episode contains discussion involving addiction, forensic findings, violence, and sexual assault indicators. So please listen with care.
Isabelle Sam was a mother, a grandmother, a sister, an Indigenous woman. She was not simply another overdose stat. She was not just another file in a police cabinet, and she belonged to people who loved her very deeply. And that really matters because one of the things systems often do after vulnerable women die, like Isabel, is they flatten them into categories. They become addicts, they become homeless, they become complicated. And somewhere inside those labels, their humanity starts disappearing.
Exactly. And when I was reading through this case, that was the one thing that haunted me the most. Isabel's death did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a much larger national crisis involving missing and murdered Indigenous people, institutional distrust, addiction, homelessness, and the long history of violence committed against Native women in this country. So when people dismiss concerns about this case as emotional overreaction, they are actually ignoring decades upon decades of documented investigative failures involving Indigenous women whose families were also told not to ask too many questions.
So in January of 2023, Isabel was found deceased in the back of a vehicle in Juneau, Alaska. The official cause of death was listed as a combination of drug intoxication that involved fentanyl and alcohol. The official manner of death was ruled accidental. Now, if someone only reads the headline version of the story, they may assume this is simply another tragic overdose in America's fentanyl crisis. But the actual investigative records tell a far more disturbing story than that.
So, according to investigative documentation and forensic records, Isabel was reportedly found with her pants and underwear pulled down. Medical personnel documented bruises and abrasions across her body. A forensic sexual assault examination was also performed. There were injuries documented involving intimate areas after death. And right there is where many people become uncomfortable because Once those details enter the conversation, this stops feeling like a simple overdose narrative.
I mean, it absolutely does. Because a death that involves drugs can still involve criminal conduct. So a woman can actually overdose and still be assaulted. A vulnerable person can still be exploited while incapacitated. Those realities are not mutually exclusive, but society increasingly behaves as though the moment fentanyl appears in a toxicology report, that every surrounding question somehow becomes irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, I think it is one of the most dangerous developments in modern death investigations. The overdose crisis has become so widespread that the presence of drugs now functions almost like a social anesthetic. People stop looking deeper, institutions stop pushing harder, the public emotionally checks out. And the people most harmed by that tendency are vulnerable women whose lives were already viewed by society as messy, chaotic, or even disposable.
Yes, and that is especially so for Indigenous women. I have spent the past year and a half just really diving into this issue, and the statistics surrounding violence against Native women is so staggering it will shock people. Indigenous women experience some of the highest rates of sexual violence, homicide, disappearances, and domestic violence in the United States.
Alaska Native women experience disproportionately high rates of violence, homelessness, addiction, and premature death. Those overlapping vulnerabilities create incredibly dangerous circumstances. But here's the part society gets wrong: vulnerability should increase investigative urgency, not reduce it.
Yeah, and that's an important point because a woman who is struggling with addiction is not less worthy of protection, and a woman who is unhoused is not less worthy of justice. If anything, those realities make her more vulnerable to exploitation and therefore more deserving of careful investigative scrutiny when she dies under disturbing circumstances.
Right. But instead, what often happens is the exact opposite. Society starts unconsciously sorting victims into categories: perfect victims and imperfect victims, respectable victims and disposable victims. If a woman struggled with addiction, people begin assuming the circumstances around her death are automatically explainable.
And you better believe that predators understand that dynamic better than anyone else. Vulnerable people are often targeted precisely because predators know that society will be slower to care, slower to investigate, and quicker to dismiss troubling circumstances once addiction or instability enters the picture.
One of the most disturbing documents in this case is the forensic nursing report. It is clinical in tone, detached in language, but underneath those medical phrases, there is a devastating picture of what professionals observed after Isabel's death. The report documented bruising to her face and extremities. It documented abrasions. It also documented injuries involving intimate areas. It documented the collection of forensic swabs from multiple parts of her body, including genital and anal swabs.
And we need the listeners to fully understand the significance of that, okay? These procedures are not done casually. They're not done because there are no concerns. These procedures happen because medical professionals believed evidence needed to be preserved in the event criminal conduct had occurred. And in Isabel's case, Amy, she was covered in bruises.
Right,
I mean,
right, which doesn't come just simply from an overdose.
no, absolutely not. And she was found with, sadly, her underclothes pulled down and her top and her bra pulled up. I mean, it was very apparent that a sexual assault occurred. That's a crime.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, the report specifically referenced post-mortem injuries consistent with anogenital penetration after death, while noting on that there was low suspicion for sex-related homicide. And that phrase has become central to discussions surrounding this case because many people interpret that as meaning no foul play occurred, but that is not actually what it says.
And I don't want to be exploitative of what happened here, but I really want the listeners to understand that Isabel was sexually assaulted prior to her death and after death. That's a crime and should be treated as such. And still here we are. And, one of the things that, mentioned was there was low suspicion of any kind of crime having happened here. But that's not the same thing as no suspicion. More importantly, that phrase does not erase the totality of the circumstances surrounding her death. You still have a deceased woman found partially undressed in a vehicle. You still have visible injuries. You still have witness statements that contained insane inconsistencies because I read them. I read the transcripts. You still have reports involving people allegedly being around her while she was quote unquote unconscious. You still have references to surveillance footage that did not materialize. And you still have a grieving family that I've talked to multiple times, Amy. And they're looking at all of this and they're saying, this does not add up.
Mhm. Yeah. One thing that struck me emotionally while researching this case was the burden placed on Isabel's family. Families in cases like this, they often become the investigator themselves because they feel like they have no other choice. They reread reports over and over again, searching for any details that they might have missed. They learn forensic language that they never wanted to know. They study timelines, they compare contradictions, they try to reconstruct final moments from incomplete records because the official explanation does not feel emotionally or factually complete.
No, and they're broken. I mean, they're strong, don't get me wrong, and they wanna get to the bottom of this, but they're traumatized, and I really think that people who have never gone through something like this, I think that sometimes they underestimate just how traumatic that process becomes. So, I mean, imagine reading autopsy findings about someone you love, someone you grew up with. Imagine seeing phrases that describe injuries like bruises, displaced clothing, intimate trauma, conflicting witness accounts, and then you're told the case is essentially settled. Families are left carrying this grief and uncertainty at the exact same time, and that uncertainty can become one of the cruelest parts of it all. I mean, you take a look at this and, okay, she could have succumbed to a fentanyl overdose. That is completely possible. Does not
Right,
change the fact that she was assaulted before and after death.
right. That there was another crime
And even if you couldn't prove the assault before death, that's definitely an assault after because she couldn't
after.
consent, she wasn't alive, and so I'm just very concerned that nobody's been charged with that crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big point for the case. But another major issue in this case, it involves surveillance footage and witness narratives. So, according to the investigative records, there were references to surveillance footage showing movements around the vehicle, along with statements from people who were reportedly present before Isabel died. But there were also indications that some footage may have been overwritten or lost before it could be fully secured.
I just think that's ridiculous because once evidence like that disappears, it's gone forever. You're not getting it. And then the families are left trying to piece together the final hours of their loved one's life through fragments of this inconsistent information, incomplete timelines, and all these unanswered questions. It's incomplete, most heart-wrenching thing I've ever seen. Back.
And the one thing I really want listeners to understand tonight is that the prosecutorial decline does not equal certainty. It does not magically transform unresolved circumstances into a complete truth.
Absolutely. And prosecutors decline charges for many reasons. Evidence is incomplete, witnesses may contradict each other, physical evidence may not be conclusive to establish criminal conduct. A case may simply not be provable beyond a reasonable doubt. But that does not mean disturbing circumstances, that they suddenly don't matter. And again, I'm going to hammer it home. She could not have consented to that sexual contact with whomever took advantage of her after her death. That is a crime, and someone should be held accountable.
Absolutely. And in Isabel's case, there are still so many disturbing circumstances.
There are, and one of the broader concerns here involves how overdose deaths can sometimes obscure surrounding criminal behavior. I mean, think about it. Overdose deaths don't happen in a moral vacuum. People
Right,
provide substances, people fail to call for help, people exploit vulnerable individuals, people panic, people move bodies, people coordinate stories, and when someone dies while incapacitated, there's always this possibility that surrounding criminal conduct is likely never going to be uncovered.
right, which is why thorough investigations matter so much.
Exactly, transparency matters, accountability matters, public trust matters. Because if institutions want communities to trust investigative conclusions, well, in cases like Isabelle Sam or cases involving Indigenous women and vulnerable victims, those same institutions cannot simply ask the public to ignore contradictions or troubling details. They need to answer to them.
Right. And another thing that deeply affected me, and I'm sure you, while reading about Isabel Sam, was how often Indigenous families described feeling invisible after their loved one dies. Many families involved in the MMIP movement say that they spend years fighting just to keep the public attention on their cases. They feel as though their loved ones are administratively erased once an official classification has been assigned to it.
Yes, and honestly, that feeling is understandable when you look at the historical record. Indigenous women have been undercounted, they've been misclassified, they've been ignored, they were marginalized within investigative systems for years, for decades. And entire families have grown up watching cases involving Native women receive less urgency, less media attention, and less public outrage. And Amy, people contact me every day. I go through extensively on a daily basis online records for Indigenous men and women and find that they're inaccurate or they've been resolved or that's never been reported to the national system. And I had someone actually contact me this morning. Thank you for covering my aunt's case. Nobody does that. It's like nobody cares. And
Right.
that just makes me so sad.
Yeah, and that's why this case matters way far beyond the Alaska border.
That's true because Isabel's story is not just about one woman's death. I think it's about, I don't know, whether vulnerable women receive the same investigative seriousness as everyone else. I work with vulnerable women every day, that are fighting addiction. And I think it's about whether addiction unconsciously becomes this excuse to stop asking harder questions. It's about whether Indigenous women are afforded the same dignity and urgency and public concerns after death that other victims often receive automatically. And Amy, the truth is that if you and I, God forbid, are a victim because we are Caucasian women, we're going to get more attention than most Indigenous cases ever will.
Right.
And that is something that I can't live with.
No, that's something that's gotta change because, you know, people are people and cases need to be covered regardless of their status in society. And it's also about whether grieving families are allowed to continue demanding the answers without being treated as emotional obstacles to institutional closures. I mean, These families need answers. It doesn't matter, you know, who their loved one was or was not. They deserve to have the same treatment for their loved one as anybody else.
And that's true. It's true because when you strip away all the paperwork and the classifications and the forensic terminology, there's something that remains painfully simple. A woman died under deeply troubling circumstances, and the people who love her still do not feel they have the full truth, and nobody has been charged with a crime, even if they cannot prove that she was murdered. Let's say that could never be proven. We have a crime that we know was committed after death.
That's right. That's right. And Isabel Sam, she deserved more than just becoming another statistic connected to an overdose epidemic.
She did, and she deserved more than being reduced to toxicology findings.
And she deserved more than simple silence.
And her family deserves transparency and accountability and honest answers regarding every unsolved and unresolved question surrounding her death.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Lost Girls.
If you have any information related to cases involving missing or murdered Indigenous women, or if you are seeking help bringing attention to a loved one's story, you can reach out through our platforms on Facebook, Instagram, and our website for all the lost girls.
Because every girl deserves justice.